Hello and welcome to the 11th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. In this series I will talk about the 10 cards that had the most competitive success in Eternal's history that fulfill a certain condition. In this case they have to be a 1-cost unit. For that I compiled a list of all decks that topped an official DireWolf event or reached top 8 in the ETS seasons of 2017 and 18. The ranking is then based on a point system. Each tier 1 top grants 2 points and each tier 2 top grants 1. Tiers are either based on how far the deck went or on how important the event was. For a more detailed explanation, check out the introduction video on my channel. 1-cost units are, obviously, very cheap. Outside of a small number of 0-cost units, they are the cheapest way to develop board presence. Entering the board earlier than your opponent can be a huge advantage, so 1-drops have to be weaker than everything that comes after, otherwise they would be broken. That means most 1-cost units get outclassed after the first few turns, but some of them are so strong early that you are fine with taking the downside, and some others have effects that make them relevant later on, and the best out of those two groups made this list. As always, feel free to write your guesses about which cards made the top of the list, or your questions about how close some cards that you expected to see missed out in the comments. And with that, let's begin. First up, we have Alesi Compre Archmage. A perfect example of a 1-drop that is good early and still relevant later into the game. She's a 1 justice and 1 time influence 1/1 rare unit, and whenever you cast a spell she gets +1/+1 and you gain 1 armor. Alesi was released in set 4, the Fall of Archenport, towards the end of the 2018 ETS season. She made an immediate impact in a new variant of TGP Aggro, a deck which already had a lot of success shortly before the release of set 4. But Alesi led to a new variant with more cheap spells and occasionally Groundwatch Breastgang, which used to cost 4 power, to search for Alesi. Additionally, she enabled a new variant of Compre Aggro that had ways to protect her, like Safe Return of Finest Hour, and that also played Breastgang to consistently find her. In 2019 she fell out of favor, except for a few tops in TGP Aggro and a 4-faction midrange list. Instead, most of her points come way later in the 2022 season, mainly due to a buff from a 1/1 to a 2/2 stat line in late 2021, and due to the release of the Creation Project in the summer of 2022. Before the release of Project, she had a few tops here and there in revitalized TGP Aggro version and in Compre Kira, but despite her strong baseline as a 2/2 for just 1 power that could easily grow bigger and bigger, she only began seeing white thread play thanks to Project. She was a staple in the most common version, FTG, but the more niche FTJS, FTJP and 5-faction versions occasionally included her too. Most of those versions played a wide number of fairly cheap spells, like Torch, the Power Burst from Power Cell, Abundance, which used to cost 1 power, Stand Together, and then for market access either Flying Crescendo, which also used to cost 1 power, or Crack the Earth. That meant Alesi was already an already big cheap unit that you could play on turn 2, or sometimes even on turn 1 if you had the Compre painting, and then she would just get bigger for the rest of the game. That was deemed as too strong by DireWolf, so they reverted their buff back to the original 1/1 stat line in early 2023, shortly after the end of the 2022 season. Next up we have Trickshot Rafian. He's a 1 justice influence uncommon 1/2 unit that grants another unit +1/+1 for each justice influence you have until the end of turn, and his original version, released in set 9 Arch and Deaths in mid-2020, also granted lifesteal for a turn in addition to the stat buff. That version was so strong that the Throne tournament right after the release of set 9, the ICQ Dead or Alive, was framed the following way. You either played a Rafian deck, or you played a deck with Curtain Call, which used to cost 2 power, so it was also a very broken card. Or if you brought anything outside of those 2 cards, you just brought the wrong deck to the tournament. Rafian was played in 22 out of 64 decks that reached day 2 in the tournament, most importantly in Rakano, Horu and Archenport influence-based decks. He was nerfed right afterwards alongside other Justice influence payoffs, and alongside Groundwatch Breastgang, which was used as a tutor for Rafian. After that, Rafian was missing a home, but not for long because Kira Ascending got released in early September 2020. Rafian was played in Mono Justice and Archenport Kiran Expedition, and in almost all Horu and some Archenpot Kira, and later in some Complex Kira decks in Throne. In 2020, he was still a main deck staple for Horu Kira, but the deck went for a slightly more value-oriented playstyle towards the end of the 2020 season, which relegated Rafian to a market card from 2021 onward. On rank 8, we have our first of, spoiler alarm, many fire 1-drops, Kazuo Melee Virtuoso. Kazuo is a 1 fire influence 2/1 rare unit that plays a 1 attack weapon with Overwhelm on himself whenever you play a relic weapon, and you can pay 4 for his ultimate to invoke a fire card, which means you get to pick between a random fire unit, spell and attachment. Kazuo is another example of a 1-drop that has impact early thanks to his decent stat line, but it also has impact later because of his potential to grow bigger if you play relic weapons, and because of the ultimate that basically allows you to draw a card later on. That combination made him a staple in aggressive fire decks in Expedition whenever he was legal. In Set 8 Expedition he was played in Praxis Acro, which wanted a lot of 1-drops for Aurelian Supplier to consistently draw cards with him. And in Rakano Acro, and thanks to his unit type, also in Rakano Onis. Some of those decks, especially the Rakano ones, played a few relic weapons like Fury Blade, Charchain Flail or Sword of Icaria, which made Kazuo a bit more threatening, but it wasn't really necessary for him to be good. So he was also played in decks that didn't have any relic weapons at all. In Set 9 Expedition he slotted into the common fire aggro decks, namely Skycrack, Stone Sky and Mono Fire aggro, and in his Set 12 rerun he was a staple in Skycrack and Stone Sky aggro, and occasionally played in Rakano, although that deck tried to play fewer 1-drops to play more high impact 2, 3, 4 and 5 drops, so he didn't make the cut quite as often. In Throne he only was a staple in Rakano Oni decks. Other fire aggro decks usually played better alternatives, some of which we will see later. Next up we have Autotread. He's a 1 fire influence uncommon 1/2 unit that can pay 1 power and discard a card to get +1/+1 and to deal 1 damage. Also, while it's on the field, all enemy units lose region and can't regenerate. For the first 1.5 years of its existence, from Tread's release in Set 10 Empire of Glass in late 2020 until June 2022, it was slightly smaller, 1/1 instead of a 1/2 stat line, but it could use its discard effect as often as you liked, so you weren't limited to just once per turn. That meant Autotread's baseline was pretty small, but it threatened to kill any 1 health unit efficiently, and it could still take down bigger threats later on, either by giving up multiple cards or by dealing damage with attacks or removal like Torch first. Its passive ability also came in handy in both Set 10 and 11 Expedition, because Vinecrafter was one of the central cards of both of those formats. All that together made Autotread a Expedition staple in Monofire Aggro in Set 10, and in FPS, FTG, FGP, Rakano, Skycrack Aggro, and Praxis Midrange in Set 11 Expedition. In Throne, Tread was occasionally played in aggro decks just for the strong baseline, but more often than that it was played because it enabled very strong synergies with other cards, which usually ended in a nerf to one of those cards or to Autotread itself. The first notable synergy was a near infinite loop enabled by Malagras Amphitheater and Sodi Spellshaper. The FTP aggro list that Team Barbarian Camp and Team CSB brought to the July 2021 Throne Open included all of those cards, because those were all decent aggro cards in their own, while also just winning the game if you drew them together. The combo worked like this. You played Autotread while you already had Theater in play, then you equipped Tread with Spellshaper, and then you discarded any card for Tread's effect to deal 1 to the opponent, which meant you got a draw from Spellshaper, and you got 2 power from Theater, and then you could just repeat that process over and over again. Discard a card that you draw with Spellshaper, get 2 power from Theater, discard a card you draw with Spellshaper, get 2 power from Theater, and so on. That only worked because both Theater and Tread didn't have a once per turn clause back then, which DireWolf quickly changed with a nerf to Theater. After that, Autotread regularly appeared in Skycrack aggro decks, but it took a few months for the next broken combo to appear. In May 2022, Nico Urban Hunter was released as part of Set 13 Unleashed. He was 3 discard fodder for Tread because the 1 damage from Tread would trigger the frenzy in void of Nico, which meant Nico came back to hand, and then you could just discard him for trade again, gets back to hand again, discard him, and so on. While it wasn't a straight up one-turn kill because you still needed to pay 1 power each time, you didn't have a mechanism to always get power back. It did still allow aggro decks like Stonescar aggro to just play Autotread on turn 1, and then you could just start discarding Nico on the next turn. Like turn 1 Autotread, turn 2 discard Nico twice, which means Autotread grows to a 3/3 stat line, attack for 3 next turn, discard Nico 3 times, attack for 6, and so on. That combo was also used in mid-range decks like Skycrack midrange, which even had additional access to Nico with no one to hold him, and in FPS Throne Room, where it was even better because each Autotread discard triggered a namesake card. All that together led to a quick nerf to Autotread, after which it only saw consistent play in FPS Throne Room. On rank 6, we have our next fire 1-drop, Kindling Carver. Carver is a 1-fire influence 1/1 uncommon unit. He can sacrifice a unit to draw a card, which has its cost reduced by 1 for the rest of the turn, but if you still have that card in hand at the end of your turn, you have to discard it. Carver is different compared to most of the previous and following entries, because he's quite bad on the first few turns of the game. At the early stage, he's basically just a 1/1 without much additional impact, and you usually only want to start using his ability a few turns into the game. But his ability to outgrind opponents in the late game makes him an exceptional 1-drop. Most repeatable card draw engines are much more expensive than that. Of course, you have to pay an extra price, you have to sacrifice a unit each time, which is a fairly hefty price for most decks. And because of that, Carver was almost exclusively played in decks with a lot of cheap units, most of which either summoned more units or had a benefit when killed, something like an Entomb effect or Corrupt. An expedition that included the FTS and FTPS sacrifice decks of set 8, and FTS, FPS, FJS sacrifice and Skycrack tokens in set 9. In Throne, Carver wasn't quite as successful as an expedition, but he still got a decent number of drops in FGS, FTS and Stonescar sacrifice, and Monofire aggro decks in 2020, and in FPS sacrifice decks in 2021. He fell out of favor after FPS sacrifice got nerfed out of playability, and hasn't seen significant competitive play since then. Next, we have our first set 1 entry, Pyronite. She's a 1-fire influence rare 2/1 unit with Overwhelm, and you can use her ultimate for 5 power to give her +4/+4. Pyronite was a staple in aggressive fire decks in the first few years of the game, even after her ultimate got nerfed from 5 to 6 power in late 2016. In 2017, she was an integral part of Arcano and Stonescar aggro, although some people opted to only play 2 copies. In 2018, she saw way less play, but it was mostly thanks to a fall in popularity of both Arcano and Stonescar aggro. She was still in most lists of those 2 decks, and she was in most lists of the newly popular Skycrack aggro deck, but she didn't make it into the most successful fire aggro deck of late 2018 and early 2019 FPS Haunted Highway. In 2019, Stonescar Arcano aggro also started to cut her more and more, which meant she basically only had Skycrack aggro as a consistent home left. She could never really recover from that, even after her nerf got reverted, and she only saw very sporadic throne play in different kinds of aggressive fire decks since 2019. She did have a little resurgence as a staple in Skycrack, Stonescar and Monofire aggro in set 9 expedition format towards the end of the 2020 season, and in Monofire aggro in set 10 expedition at the start of 2021 though. On rank 4, we have the newest card on this list, Battlefront Dasher. He's a 1-fire influence uncommon 2/1 unit, and on summon you can contract for 2 to give a unit +1/+1 in charge. That means you can play Dasher as a free 2 with charge on turn 1, but then you skip your next turn because you have to pay off the 2 power debt from contract. Alternatively, you can just play him as a 2/1 on turn 1, or use him later to give one of your other units charge, or to buff one of your other units that was already on the board to enable better attacks, or to remove Aegis from an opponent's unit by just targeting the opponent's unit. That flexibility made him a staple in aggressive fire decks in both Expedition and Throne. In the later, he got most of his points in the classic fire aggro decks like Stonescar or Skycrack aggro, but he also made his way into a few creation project lists, And his ability to give charge earned him a spot in an FTP Summoner 7 combo deck, because you could play 7 on turn 4, play Dasher, target 7, which means 7 could immediately attack and play some kind of big unit from your hand. Most of his points come from Expedition though. The FUSET 12 tournaments at the end of the 2021 and start of the 2022 season were dominated by aggressive fire decks, most importantly Rakano and to a lower extent Skycrack and Stonescar aggro. And Dasher was played in almost every single list. After the release of Set 13 Unleashed, those decks fell in popularity, but Dasher quickly found a home in the new Tier 1 aggro deck, FPS aggro. His ability to buff other units was especially good in the deck because it meant that Felnedep could attack every turn without any need to trigger Frenzy. Next up we have another Oni Ronin. He's a 1 fire influenced common 2/1 unit with Warcry. Like Pyronite, Oni Ronin was released in Z1 and became a staple in aggressive fire decks in the ETS seasons of 2017 and 18. But while Pyronite was occasionally reduced to 2 copies or cut completely from some Rakano or Stonescar aggro lists, Ronin was played in really almost all of them. His play rate still fell in 2018 thanks to the fall of classic fire aggro decks and also his exclusion from FPS Haunted Highway. But contrary to Pyronite, he went on to see consistent throne play in the years after. In 2019 he rarely made it into Stonescar lists, mostly because they decided to cut on 1-drops entirely to play more top end like Vara, Vengeance Sieger, Vicious Highwayman or Eclipse Dragon. But he remained a staple in both Skycrack and Rakano aggro, and he even occasionally made it into Skycrack ED lists. From 2020 onward, he saw play in a wide number of different fire aggro decks, most importantly Skycrack, Stonescar and Monofire, but the release of strong anti-aggro 2-drops like Granad or Winecrafter made him a lot less threatening over time. Another good unit against Oni Ronin is our number 2, Granad Drone. It's a 1 fire influence common 1/1 unit that plays another 1/1 Granad on summon. Like Oni Ronin and Pyronite, Drone was part of the very first set, the Empty Throne, but contrary to them it was rarely played in Rakano aggro and only played in the most aggressive versions of Stonescar aggro, Burn Queen, a variant that combined a lot of cheap units with Bandit Queen and burn spells like Obliterate or Flameblast as finisher, and Stonescar Cheeto, which played as many 1-drops as possible in combination with the namesake card, which used to cost 1 power back then, so Cheeto would also give herself charge, to end games really fast. While drones saw less play in those classical aggro decks, it was important for decks with sacrifice effects like Stonescar or FTS Granad decks, and for decks with board-wide buffs like FTP Shimmerback or FTJ tokens, because it was by far the best deal for decks that just wanted a lot of bodies on board for cheap. Some people also included Drone in the 15-card sideboard of midrange and control decks, because an early Granad Drone could slow down aggro decks by providing 2 blockers against early threats like our previous entries Pyronite and Oni Ronin. Just for information, the ETS seasons of 2017 and for the most part 2018 used the best of 3 system with 15-card sideboards, so you could switch out cards between games. And Granad Drone was just one good example of a card that you wouldn't normally play in most mid-range decks, but it could come in handy against other fire aggro decks. In 2018, Drone continued to see some play in Stonescar aggro, and it found its way into most Skycrack aggro lists, but it had way more success than both Ronin and Pyronite because it also slid right into FPS Haunted Highway and into Praxis tokens. Both decks were interested in additional bodies, Praxis tokens because of payoffs like Rally and Scene and Obelisk, and FPS Haunted Highway because it wanted sacrifice fodder for Combust and Devour. The Granad unit type also started to matter more. In Skycrack Canadians, it was important to get 2 power instead of 1 from Combustion Cell to get those big swing turns with Kenna and End of Hostilities earlier. And in Stonescar Grenadines, it made Gear Cruncher better. Over the following years, Drone continued to see play in classic fire aggro decks like Stonescar or Skycrack, and decks with sacrifice synergies like FGS and FTS sacrifice decks in 2020 and FPS Praxis Draft decks in 2021, and in decks with board buffs like FTG Creation Project decks in 2022. But all that was not quite enough to reach the number 1 spot, which was not taken by a Fire 1-drop like the last 7 entries, but instead by a time stable from set 1, Initiate of the Sense. Initiate is a one-time influence common 1/1 unit, and while you control her, you gain +1 maximum power. Contrary to most entries on this list, Initiate was not primarily used in aggro decks. Instead, she was played in mid-range decks that try to utilize the power boost of Initiate to play their big threats a turn earlier. In 2017, that included decks like Combre or Legion midrange, which just wanted to play big units like Sandstorm Titan or Predatory Carnosaur a turn earlier, and decks like TGP and a Legion Shimmer Pack and TGP midrange, which also played additional payoffs for small units with cards like Shimmer Pack, Xenon Obelisk, which also profited from Initiate's power boost because it meant you reached the 8 maximum power earlier, and Stand Together. In 2018 and 19, Initiate continued to see heavy play in midrange decks like Praxis Pledge or Compre midrange, but she also found way into more aggressive decks like Praxis Tokens or Compre aggro. Time midrange decks fell out of favor towards the end of the 2019 season, and Initiate got more and more competition over the years, with 2-power ramp dogs like Trailmaker or Devotee of the Sense, and later on with another 1-power ramp dog, Logistics Expert, which led to a significantly fewer tops in 2020 and 2021. In 2022, she had a bit of a resurgence in FTG Creation Project decks. Those decks could consistently play on turn 1 thanks to 8 paintings with time influence, Compre and Praxis Painting, Xultan Conclave and Diplomatic Seal, so you had up to 16 ways to consistently get time influence on turn 1 undepleted. And if they had the right power next turn, they could sometimes immediately curve Initiate into Project, because Project used to cost 3 power on release. So if you started with Praxis Painting, play Initiate, and then on the next turn you just needed an undepleted Justice Source, and you could play Project on turn 2, and that could just easily steamroll a game. That resurgence was enough for Initiate to secure a small 9-point lead ahead of Granad and Ronin, and with that rank 1 on this list. This marks the end of the 11th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. You can find the introduction video and all previous episodes on my channel. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a nice week.